Hi, good afternoon. How's everybody? Last panel of the conference, or the last series, so welcome to all of you. There are 281 million international migrants in the world right now, according to United Nations estimates. That represents about 3.6% of the global population, which means most of us stay home. Most of us stay within our own borders. We stay home. But there are another 55 million estimated internally displaced people. So there are a lot of people on the move. Migration is not static. There are constant shifts in scale, direction, demographics, and frequency. So there's an awful lot to talk about in the next hour, but we'll try to kind of rein it in a little bit. My name is Cathleen Farrell, and I am the Chief Communications Officer for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. The Sisters of Mercy are the largest congregation of Catholic sisters in the United States and one of the largest in the world. The sisters have 5 critical concerns, which are anti-racism, the well-being of women and children, nonviolence, care of the earth, and migration. And their focus in understanding migration is the root causes. Of course, all those critical concerns intersect, and we're going to probably talk a little bit about that today. Prior to working for Mercy, I was the Director of Communications for the National Immigration Forum, and those of you who were in the plenary this morning saw my old boss, a young guy named Ali Noorani, speaking very articulately, as always, about democracy. I'm also an immigrant, and I'll let you guess, where I'm from. So I'm going to introduce our panel. Daniela Segovia, who's in the middle and didn't want to sit in the middle, but there she is. Daniela is a foreign policy analyst and international cooperation consultant. She works for UNHCR, but she is not here in that capacity. She's not speaking on behalf of her employer. She is, however, an Eisenhower Fellow, 2019. And during her time as a fellow, Daniela explored how international organizations were mitigating the growing migrant crisis in Latin America. She's originally from Venezuela and currently lives in Mexico. Maria Echaveste is the president and CEO of the Opportunity Institute, and this is from their mission statement. The Opportunity Institute seeks to increase social and economic mobility and advance racial equity through partnership and collaboration with those seeking to promote systems changes. Maria has built a distinguished career as a consultant, a lecturer, a senior White House official in the Clinton administration, and as a corporate attorney. And to my immediate left is Miriam Jordan, who is a national correspondent for the New York Times, where she covers immigration. Her grassroots reporting helps not just tell the stories of those millions on the move, but helps us also understand the reasons people migrate, how their arrival impacts societies and communities, and how we receive them in the public policy arena and in our communities. So the title of the panel is Millions on the Move. Migration is hardly a new phenomenon. People move for opportunity, and that's a key word here. One of those opportunities is safe haven, and we're going to discuss that quite a bit. Jobs, love, a lot of things. We're going to invite you not to look for solutions this afternoon, but we're going to invite you into a reflection about who is on the move now and how communities, countries, and policymakers are welcoming migrants or not. So I'm going to start with Miriam, and I'm going to ask you to set the scene for us here, Miriam. A few weeks back, you had a piece in the Times that began, quote, "They come from Brazil, Burkina Faso, Uzbekistan, India, and dozens of other countries. A moving global village of hundreds of thousands of people crossing the Rio Grande and slipping through gaps in the border wall at a pace of nearly 9,000 people a day, one of the highest rates of unlawful crossings in months." So what struck me, though, about the lead was not just the sheer numbers of border crossers, but the variety of countries that you cite, the countries of origin, a veritable global village. So who are these migrants? Can you tell us about the global village?
Right. So I've been doing this for... Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Oh, boy. Hi, everybody. So I've been writing about immigration in to the United States since 2004. I write about legal immigration, unlawful immigration, high-skilled immigrants, low-skilled immigrants, a few years ago, since I started doing this in 2004, I thought, my gosh, this is getting so repetitive. Like we will never have immigration reform. You know, people crossing the border are the same people as always. It's the Mexicans and the Central Americans, you know, coming here for opportunity, fleeing poverty. Then there was gang violence, but it became somewhat repetitive. In the last few years, my job has become so much more interesting to me because, as I said in that piece, there is this, what seems to be a moving and unstoppable global village coming to the United States. And it's despite new border barriers, despite razor wire, you know, despite risk of deportation, it's this tide pushing across despite efforts by the Biden administration to offer legal pathways. Already this year, we've had about 400,000 people bound for the U.S. who have crossed the Darien Gap, which is this sort of treacherous jungle that straddles Colombia and Panama. There is a surge that could be happening right now. It's not clear. But, you know, why is this happening? You know, as Cathleen was saying, we're seeing, you know, displacement at record levels worldwide, of course, and that's leading to this kind of fundamental change in part in the composition of the migrant population. When I was in San Diego recently, I met Africans from almost a dozen countries. I put my French, my Portuguese, and my Spanish to very good use. I mean, aside from people from Burkina Faso, Ghana, Mauritania, Senegal, Togo, Angola, there were people from Afghanistan, China, Vietnam, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, on and on. So why? In the Western Hemisphere alone, we've had unprecedented displacement that followed the pain inflicted on economies by COVID, making it more difficult for people to provide for their families. Cuba lost, you know, hard currency, its tourism, you know, its tourism sector pretty much plummeted. No Americans, no Canadians, no Russians. Then in Venezuela, we have a country that is, embroiled in economic and political mayhem. You know, some 7 million Venezuelans have left the country. They now represent, I think, the biggest displaced population in the world. In Ecuador, drug cartels are taking over entire, portions of the country and creating, a situation that the government is having a really hard time controlling and making it difficult for people to make a livelihood. That's sending people to our border. And beyond our region, why is this happening? Because the reach of the smuggling networks that make this possible has increased tremendously in recent years. The advent of social media and WhatsApp that facilitates marketing far and wide by these networks. Their footprint reaches all the way to Africa, to India, to Pakistan. And, they pitch their line basically that folks will have guaranteed entry into the United States. And they pretty much deliver on that, although some people don't make it along the way. And thousands of migrants actually who do cross the border are being deported now. And, based on whether there are flights to their countries, whether we have diplomatic ties with their countries, whether border officials decide, and there's a lot of subjectivity here, to, not release somebody into the country. But there is a major pull factor, and that is because of the sheer numbers, so many people are being released into the country now. The Biden administration does not want large numbers of people in these holding facilities where they're processed along the border, images of, unsanitary conditions, images of helplessness. And as a result, they're processing people very quickly when they have large numbers and allowing them to get to destinations across the United States where they, for the most part, are advised to apply for asylum, whether they have a strong case or not.
So let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
Let me grab this. So you mentioned, so you've set the scene, all these people from all over the place, and it's a different migration, right? We saw when you began covering this, a lot of Mexicans, Central Americans, and they came to communities. They had somewhere to go and somebody there, even if it's a second or third cousin or my friend's brothers, whatever. What are we seeing with these folks? Are they arriving, so once they cross the border and they're being encouraged to apply for asylum, is anybody helping them? Are communities, do they have communities? Are there communities of Venezuelans? Venezuelans are a relatively new migration. And I know Maria wants to say something.
Right. So what I think that, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I feel like I can't say it enough, that we have had a very large influx of Venezuelans into this country. And this wave of migration is a very new phenomenon. So the Venezuelans arriving now, for the most part, and I meet them by the thousands at the border, do not have a network in the United States. They don't have friends and family who are already established who can give them a mattress on the floor or a couch to sleep on. And that's what's so different for them, because even the poorest peasant from Guatemala or Mexico has an uncle or aunt or cousin or friend in Los Angeles or Atlanta or in Alabama or in Iowa who's going to receive them. But the Venezuelans are coming in large numbers, and they have nowhere to really find support. And given that they've turned themselves into authorities at the border, what also distinguishes them from Mexicans and Central Americans, at least from the old days, is that they don't mind intersecting with or interfacing with authority. It's not like they just want to go to the construction job in Atlanta and live in the shadows. They have already turned themselves in. They're in deportation proceedings. They're going to apply for asylum. So they're also going to seek the help that's available. And with these buses that were offered for free to cities like New York and Chicago and Denver, they were happy to get a free ride, because by the time they reach the border, they have nothing left. Many of them have been robbed, and many of them to begin with didn't have very much money, because some of them are actually poor urban Venezuelans. So they were delighted to get on these buses, delighted to get to New York, and of course by word of mouth. Even, the largest percentage of folks arriving in New York are actually not arriving on the buses. They're arriving through other means. Maybe some, they managed to buy a ticket on a Greyhound bus, but they have heard that there's shelter there, or they've heard that there's shelter in Chicago, or that someone's going to help them get up on their feet. And that's kind of like created this effect of, I hear there's opportunity there for being assisted.
I have to jump in.
Okay.
Yes, that particular story right now with Venezuela. But it's an old story. We had Central Americans fleeing the conflict in the wars in the 80s. And at the time, there weren't those routes. Luckily.
The first ones, yeah.
Yes, the first ones in much the same way. Right. And you had, the sanctuary movement, the churches. So if we step back a little bit, yes, it is fascinating from a sociological perspective, I think, to say all these different people are coming in. But we have, if I always say, we will never control immigration. We can't control migration. You can manage it. We can have it be more orderly, and we can get into that. But the other part, encouraging applications for asylum, that is because we have a really out-of-date U.S. immigration system. So if the only avenue for most people is asylum, and to make that case, and it's a very hard bar. And one of the things that was done from the 96 law was, we're going to keep you in jail. We're going to have you in holding because if you're going to apply for asylum, it's not going to be easy street. So you must really be afraid for your life to be willing to spend a year or a year and a half in a holding cell. So encourage is, I would take issue with encourage, is like that may be the only option. And the chances of actually getting it, depending on where you're from, and you have to show exactly, you have to have credible fear. And they really go
where you're from and where you're applying for it is significant as well.
And we have someone from Venezuela.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I would like to outline that every experience is different when we are talking about migration, okay? Obviously, Venezuelans traditionally used to receive migrants. That is why we don't used to have this diaspora prepared to receive people. Because in the contrary, we receive people. When I started to work at the United Nations as an intern, 20 years ago, 2001, I remember I started at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and we work in receiving Colombians refugees. And another aspect that is very interesting when we are talking about Venezuelans is the fact that many Venezuelans have dual citizenship, for example. And yes, the last years we are experimenting high flows, people who decide to migrate to other countries. The first flow wave were to the United States, the middle class, for example, and to Europe. And most recently, we are witnessing this movement in South America. And I mentioned with you, but I don't only want to focus on the Venezuelans.
Okay,
I am Venezuelan as well, but I would
so
like to
you
talk
did
about
share-
the global south.
Right, you
but
talked
later
about-
maybe.
Right, you talked about some very interesting numbers.
Yes.
Because we do focus on the U.S. We are in the U.S., and the U.S. has a free and open press, and so we're able to find out an awful lot that we're not able to find out in other countries. But what is the biggest country that's receiving, is it refugees or migrants?
Well, it's interesting. In the case of the Venezuelans, Colombia, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And globally, it's really interesting when we check out the figures, the numbers, because usually people think about, I don't know, Europe or the United States. But when we are talking about migrants and refugees, it's really interesting because the global south, usually the countries of people from the global south migrate to the neighbors countries. From the global south to the global south, not to the the global north. So that is interesting because in the case of Venezuelans, is for example, Colombia, Peru, there are many, Chile, and with Chile, it's very interesting because of the experience with Chile, many people fail in their path to regularization and decide to migrate to the United States. And not only happen with Venezuelans, also happen with people from Haiti, okay? In large numbers. But I would like to put on the table the example of countries such as Turkey, who are receiving a lot of people as well, and Uganda.
So is Turkey, are they refugees or migrants in Turkey? Can we distinguish?
Yes.
Okay.
That is right, because usually when we are talking about a migrant, it's a person who decides to flee looking for a better life. When we are talking about a person who is a refugee, this person cannot go back to their home country because their life is in risk, okay? So if you are a refugee, you cannot, if you are abroad, obviously, you cannot ask for help in your home country. You cannot ask for consular assistance, for example. So that is the difference. And well, there are many people, the floods is mixed in the global south, in everywhere. But we can see it's a very complex situation.
The causes are mixed?
When we are talking about the causes, you know very well. We are talking about human rights violations, for example. We are talking about war and atrocities we are witnessing right now. It's very sad. And we are talking also about climate change. Mm-hmm. And also, I mentioned to you the fact that in Afghanistan was an earthquake. So it's a mix. It's not only the natural disaster, but also the political situation that is deteriorating and democratic backsliding in other countries. So like
people
there's
don't fit neatly into a box. You're a refugee or a migrant.
Well, and I think that's really important. Think for a moment. Migrants leaving for a better life because there's no job opportunity, there's no education, there's no future for them or their children. Okay, it's a continuum, right? Somehow, if you're leaving for quote unquote economic reasons, that's less compelling than if you're fleeing because you're being persecuted because you're gay, or because you're a different religion, or because you have political views. But I would submit to you that that distinction is partly responsible for the way in which, or at least the US, but this is also true in other countries.
It's quite interesting because I mentioned to you before the fact that many people, they don't recognize themselves as a refugees. In the case that, for example, in Central America, they flee their homeland just because they say, it's because of an economical reason, and it's not. It's because of the gang. They don't have enough money to pay for the gangs. And no?
So the reason is I don't have the money to pay the gangs because, so it's, yeah.
But I think that's part of our challenge of us trying to figure out, is that a useful distinction when we're trying to manage?
Sometimes it is. In the case to outline the vulnerability of the refugee. But I agree with you because, for example, I am a migrant and I face a lot of challenges. For example, how many of you have a credit card? Many. I'm pretty sure you don't have to turn out your hand. But it's quite interesting. I arrived here 2 days ago with no credit card because I am a migrant in Mexico. And in Mexico, I have a regular status in Mexico, okay? But for me, it's really hard to get a credit card because I am not a Mexican citizen. And it's only a few things, and I am a migrant, I'm not a refugee. And to be here at the hotel, I have to request for help to get a credit card. And it's a few examples. And there are many others. There are a lot of people, migrants, who lose their documents and they cannot access to services, for example. And it's terrible, or education or for health, just because you don't have, and the barrier of the language, for example. You don't have to be a refugee to struggle, like me right now, when you're talking in another language. And like,
the system is outdated. So we're using outdated definitions.
I think we're using outdated definitions. However, I actually think we have a situation in which we have declining birth rates in Western countries, right? Japan's the most, but all across, including the US. We have workforce needs for our own economic, let's take the US. And so one could argue that in addition to the violence, all the reasons for people moving, that there is some value in coming up with a different scheme that allows an orderly movement of people. And let me say something. Most people don't want to leave their country. Most people don't. The ones who do, it is that human spirit. Some will stay and starve and just deal with the violence, and others will say, to hell with it, I'm going to take my chance, I'll cross the Mediterranean, I'll put myself in a hold of a ship or in a container truck and die from the heat and lack of water in the southern desert. So how do we manage that? And then that, to me, raises another fundamental issue as human beings, which is that we are afraid of the other. So add those two things. Human spirit, we're going to move. Some of us, at least. And two, we're afraid of the other. So how do we treat the stranger in our land? when we, for all the reasons we understand, as anthropology was my major in undergrad, how do we deal with the comfort that we have of being with people who are like us, who share our values, who share our language? How do we manage that, given what we are facing? And I remember attending a climate conference about 10 years ago when Mary Robinson was at that meeting. You think you have migration? You just wait for climate change. And now we are seeing it. So I really, yes, all these issues, and I tell my students, if you want to learn about which form to fill out, that's not the class to take from me. I'm interested in what are the social, political, economic, what can we do to deal with the root causes? I happen to be, my parents were in the Bracero program. And then they got their green card. And the moment he got the green card, my father in South Texas, he asked his boss for a raise. And the patron kicked him off the farm because he thought, I'm going to have basically this indentured, person to work on my farm. And I'm always glad that I'm the only one born in Texas. I'm so glad we left Texas for California. But he, unlike many people, actually went back to Mexico. To Mexico. And I would tease him and say, everybody else wants to stay with their children and their grandchildren. But you, Papa, you want the animals. You have your rancho, you have your cattle. He was happier. Most people do want to go back, but then family happens. So how do we regularize it?
Well, this is an interesting issue for you since you worked under the Clinton administration, because Clinton was the first president who erected barriers along the border. And that was the beginning of the end of cyclical migration. I've been working on a piece about elderly undocumented farm workers, and they all came right after the amnesty in 1986, right? The last time they could legalize. And every one of them told me that they used to come and go, but it became dangerous, it became expensive, it became impossible, and so they stayed. Some of them started new families here, some of them brought their families or brought their girlfriend or their wife and then grew their family here. But the fortification of the border is a major factor in the end of cyclical migration. However, what you were also talking about is the need, if we ever have immigration reform, of very robust guest worker programs, because as you pointed out, we need the labor and everybody's kicking and screaming for it, but we don't have the schemes in place to bring people. The H-2A program, which is a program for seasonal agricultural workers, 10 years ago, farmers were screaming and shouting to me about how they hated the program. They had to supply housing to the farm workers who came from Mexico, and there were maybe 10,000 a year coming. Last year, I think there were 380,000 who came on the program, partly because so many undocumented farm workers are elderly and their kids don't want to be farm workers, right? So we really have a dire need of farm workers, even in California, so there's no choice but to import them. But the people I meet, there are a lot of problems with the program. There's abuse, there are brokers who skim some of the money of some of the folks who come, but by and large, the people I've interviewed are delighted to come for 4, 5, 6 months and return to Mexico, return to Guatemala, return to Haiti.
Let's just, one quick second. Let's just establish a couple of themes that keep going through this. So I started by saying there are 281 million people on the move, which is less than 4% of the world population. So I think we all agree that people do prefer to stay home. There is that small group who are kind of adventurous, right? The other thing that I'm hearing is that we have a very outdated system. It's not just about the economic needs, which is very clear. I mean, I often think, when was the last major reform? 96? 96?
96, but it was under a Republican House, so it was very, very draconian and very restrictive.
So would you drive a car that's almost 30 years old, with standards that are, we are driving an economy and our values as a nation that don't respond to
when we look at just U.S. law.
Yeah.
we went from 1924 to 1965 fundamentally with
Right.
minor
For
changes.
40
except-
years. Yeah.
So
we're in dire need of an overhaul. And then the other, of course, is the criteria, looking at the criteria that we have for who could really qualify as a refugee. Just this conversation about, and I had the same experience meeting Venezuelans this summer when I was at the border, who were telling me, I sold everything. I have absolutely nothing. I didn't have very much to begin with. Well, they didn't have anything because of all the political turmoil, which had wrought economic collapse, et cetera, and the absence of strong presence of the state. So a chaotic society, right? I mean, I'm not going to go further than that, but a chaotic society which led them to leave. And these people who had absolutely nothing, had nothing to go back to, and did not have even a safe environment in which to live. That sounds like somebody who should be able to come to this country and seek safe haven, right?
Right,
But
absolutely. Oh, except that I was, the refugee asylum is like the tail of the dog.
Mm-hmm.
Really important for all the reasons we understand. For how do you tell someone you're threatened in your life and we're not going to give you safe haven? I get that. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the discussion becomes about refugees and asylees, and we don't pay attention to these other fundamental issues, which if we had an orderly process, and to your point about the economic, and I take issue with the word guest worker, because it's a temporary worker program, but we need to understand it's never just temporary. A lot of people do want to go back, and I have a lot of cousins in Mexico who are in Canada because they have a particularly good kind of program. So when we were...
People also change their minds. I can tell you as an immigrant, when I came to this country, we didn't know if, we had actually come from Colombia, from Bogota, and we didn't know, we'll be here a few years. Well, my children were little, and before, when my youngest came home from nursery school one day and said, our 16th president was, and I'm like, okay, that's it, we're here. This is so people change their minds. So I also take issue with, it's just something that benefits the host country. It's got to benefit,
right.
Benefit the
what I
visa
was going to
holders.
say about the temporary nature is we have to have the bad thing about the Bracero program of the past and the various guest worker like H2A was the lack of attention to deal with people changing their minds.
And
Life
hearts.
happens.
Becoming good citizens and becoming good members of the community. Well, becoming members of the community. You don't want to use the term good citizens, but I love my community. I love my parish. I love my children's school.
I
right?
describe it as life happens. You
Yes,
fall in
life
love,
happens,
and that's how you become.
But your children start to identify, if you have children, they start to identify as members of the community, and you're pulled into that if you're an immigrant. And that's certainly pretty typical. I want to stay here. Their children may not know the country they were even born in.
But I wanted to be a bit of a
life
devil.
happens. Yes, life happens.
A bit of a devil's advocate on your point about, economic versus, persecution. I think that the United States and, the international community has a 1951 convention that is probably outdated, that has 5 grounds for, being defined as a refugee, and climate change is not one of them, and it's a matter of huge debate now. But I still think that we need an asylum system in which people who are fleeing for their lives are given a certain preference or over people who are leaving for merely, I don't want to diminish, but to get for a better life. Everybody deserves a better life, but at what point? Not everybody can be allowed into the United States.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's what's really tricky. And it's very discouraging. We're talking about how our system is outdated. It's more than outdated. It's completely dysfunctional. But I don't feel, in all my years writing about immigration, I don't think we've been further from reaching a consensus to pass immigration reform than we are now. And that's really disturbing given the fact that there are record numbers of people who are displaced and who are showing up here.
I would just say, because we're talking about global migration, it's an issue not just for the U.S., right? Europe has to perhaps otherwise people will keep trying to come to the U.S. No, but I do think that you're right, Miriam, that we've never been further apart, but it's partly the politics in this country. Also in Europe, right? We have right-wing governments or very conservative.
And behind each migrant family and behind each host community, there is a story. And those stories need to be heard to understand the phenomenon. And we need to close the views, to have the big picture. We have to take into account also the host communities. And it's the case of Lampedusa Island, for example, in Italy. It's incredible. They are overwhelmed. And we have to put them in the equation. And it's the same, I don't know, in Panama, Necoclí, in Colombia. So it's really interesting in the border here. So Texas, for example.
I totally agree. I always say, when we're in the U.S., when we're having this discussion, it isn't racist. If you're a small superintendent of a small school district in Georgia, and you suddenly realize you've got 35% non-English speaking students, and where do you go for help for educating? And you're asking, or you're Nebraska. All of a sudden, all the meat plants are foreign workers, Spanish speakers, because they've destroyed the unions in the meat packing industry, and they use H-2B and other programs. You can understand people in that community saying, well, wait a minute, how did my community change like this? And where do I go for help? And oh, by the way, all those economists who talk at the macro level about how good immigration is for our economy, yeah, at the macro level, but in the little community, what are the resources? Where are we helping them with the schools, with the emergency room visits to the hospital because they don't have health insurance?
But aren't we a country of immigrants?
Oh,
I thought I'd pull that one.
I always certainly the United States prides itself as being a nation of immigrants. But when you look at our history, we have never welcomed any group with open arms. Watch Gangs of New York. It's like Irish versus the new Irish, or Italian, every wave. And that's where the economic pull, right? Why did we open up?
Are you saying our proud tradition is not welcoming immigrants, and who's the next one?
I just want us to be honest about it.
Okay. I think that's a good place to start.
Well, I'm much more positive about it in the sense that when this country, I'm only speaking about the U.S., every country has its own origin story, but for the U.S., I always refer to the Second Federalist paper by John Jay, who says Providence, meaning God, has given this beautiful land to a people with the same language, with the same values, committed to the same future. It was a lie when it was written. The most virulent anti-German was Ben Franklin. He hated that there were bilingual schools for German and English because he was afraid that the U.S. would become German-speaking. What we've done is every generation, we've defined American. I always argue with some of my family members when they say, pero los americanos. I'm saying, no, we're American. When you say Americanos, you mean European American, Caucasian. No, we're American. And very proud of my heritage, very proud, but I'm an American first. So we've been defining who gets to be American, and we need to finish getting immigration reform done.
Right, okay. So we're going back a little bit to Venezuelans, but this is just to help us with a bigger issue, which is equity. So Maria, you and I had talked about a nation's sovereign right to decide who gets to come in and who gets to stay. Fair enough. I think that's certainly a worthwhile discussion, but not everybody comes in the same way. And recently, the Biden administration granted temporary protected status, so TPS, to Venezuelans who had arrived in the country, I think it's before August 1st of this year, right? that gives them a status for, we say temporary, but there are communities who have had it for several decades. So whether or not that gives, it's a sure thing, people can live here safely for decades. Is there an equity issue here with that? What do you think, Miriam?
I definitely, the first thing I thought about when I heard that he was, basically at the stroke of a pen, legalizing for all intents and purposes 500,000 Venezuelans. What about the farm worker lady in Georgia who's 79 and still picking blueberries every day and doesn't have a safety net to fall back on? Like, she's still in the shadows. She still could be, picked up and placed in deportation proceedings. And she's got like 5 American kids. And she's been contributing to this country and feeding this country for decades. So it's a hard story to write, and my editors are sort of scratching their heads, but I've raised this issue. One of the problems is that I haven't... It's
also not a popular narrative, right? Because you're saying, well, thank God we're giving relief to these people, while we're forgetting about the longer term members
but
of our
it's
community.
not really, it's about giving the people relief, but it's also Biden placating his fellow Democrats, right? The mayors of New York and Chicago, who have been having to shoulder the large numbers of people and, at the cost, of billions of dollars at this point?
Right, and getting TPS means you can get work authorization.
No, absolutely.
And that is, but when we talk about equity...
And you can get retirement benefits if they're here long enough, which the old lady in Georgia is not getting anything.
But when we talk about the lack of equity, I'm very reminded, and you raised the Clinton era. So the 96 law was a really awful law, and then efforts were made to fix some of it. And one of them was the Nicaraguan Central American Relief Act. And one of my frustrations, I was in the White House at the time, was that we had worked out, it wasn't amnesty, it was basically putting the paths to regularize status for Central Americans the way it was before the 96 law. Okay, you still had to meet certain... Lo and behold, Elias Ballard, one of the Ballard brothers in South Florida. Oh, if you fled communism from the Nicaraguans, the Sandinistas, you can apply for citizenship in 1 year. But if you've come from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, you're going to have to wait the 5 years. And I remember the ledge person, I'm like, that's wrong. I mean, you're fleeing violence. And well, we cut a deal. At least we're helping people. I am proud. We helped almost 1 million people, and it's still good law. But equity, lack of equity. Oh, and then my favorite, I never got more calls about immigration than for one little boy, Elian Gonzalez. How many remember?
Yeah, the Cuban.
Oh my God. Every senator, Democrat or Republican, were calling. Either send him back, don't send him back. Mostly don't send him back. His mother died to bring him to the U.S.
So one thing that Daniela did want to talk about is the really vulnerable people. And Miriam, you and I talked about this a little bit too, about smugglers and how people come to
the
this
people
country.
in the shadows.
Yeah.
Because it's the other side of the coin as well. Migration is a huge phenomenon, but I would like to outline the fact that how difficult it is when you are forced to flee. Maybe I'm not talking about refugees exactly, but because of the circumstances, and suddenly you decide, and you have to flee, and with no resources. And imagine, with no passport, for example, with no documents, with no credit card. Well, I'm joking because of my experience, but many people with not, if you don't have an identity card, you are nobody. And how hard is to do that journey. I would like, for example, I was thinking about the comparison between the experience of navigating this journey going through the Mediterranean Sea and the Darien Gap, So the psychological experience as well. So in what condition you are going to arrive to the new destination. And there are many things implied here. And I would like to outline the fact that you never know if you are the next. Maybe it's so dramatic, but happens. violence. Okay, many of you maybe have experienced that, and you never. Yeah, when I was young, I never thought that I was going to live abroad in this way. For example,
I'm only laughing. I'm contemplating, depending on what happens in 2024, can I move to Canada or Portugal?
yeah, and why to think it as a global situation, no? When we are witnessing what is happening, the coup d'etat in Africa, and we are witnessing a lot of mess in the world. You mentioned here the first day of the event. What is happening right now, and how we are going to respond, what we should do. And there are a lot of international mechanisms and legal framework, but I think it's needed is the political will and this kind of awareness and solidarity. So
Miriam, you wanted to say something about smuggling networks? We talked a bit about them too.
well.
But, yeah.
Well, right. I mean, people, mortgage their homes. They sell, their land. They sell their motorcycle to come up with $10,000 or $20,000 to pay smugglers to reach the border.
And the human trafficking in those routes, you can.
And
the risk of
people are abducted. People, for ransom. People are. Are frisked and extorted. And one of the reasons the Venezuelans are also getting on the Bestia train, this cargo train, and I met a mother who had gotten on this train, and there are lots of families with young children, with her with four small children. I could not believe it. But it's because that way they avoid going through Mexico and having to pay off, Mexican corrupt officials who stop them along the way, or to pay another coyote, because it depends. Like the Venezuelans are doing it by hook or by crook. There are other people who get kind of a concierge service, like the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Chinese, and they kind of get door-to-door service.
And even so, we think about when we were debating immigration reform in 2006 and 2007, I helped start the first coalition for comprehensive immigration reform. Thank you, Atlantic Philanthropies, Charles Feeney, if any of you. At any rate, yes, no, I know. But one of the issues was the argument about, we need to put education and more points if you're educated, and the issue would be, that's going to work against countries like Mexico or Central America level of education, and only benefit Indians. And I always would say, trust me, if India was south of the border of the U.S., we would be getting not just the highly educated. Absolutely. So it's a question. And as you've, Miriam, as you have reported, you are seeing people from all over, right? It's no longer just the south of the border. So this issue of, what are the right terms and conditions? There are actually a couple of law professors, both at UC Berkeley, but one of the MacArthur Fellow, that MacArthur Genius grantee, trying to come up, what is the right, how do you put a human rights standard that could help guide countries to come up with those rules? And then, of course, the political will, which right now in the U.S. we do not have.
So we started a little bit late, so I think they'll give us a few extra minutes to take questions. Folks have anything they're curious about?
You talk a lot about immigration from Latin America or Central America, but I didn't hear yet about, Iraqis, Afghans, and people from other religions and how they are treated here. And as you said, people are not welcome, and they feel that they're not welcome. So how you feel about it, and what do you think might be done? Not only change the law or the policy, you have to change minds. So how you see this, not only with people who come here for working in farms, but with people who have to, someone, I think you said adventures. I mean, I don't think it's an adventure if you have to flee from your country.
No, that's right. That's a different type.
Poor countries, pay if Chinese or Pakistanis, they pay more, that's why they have more, let's say, door to door. So it's like a trade, and it's ugly. And so I want to hear from you.
I think that issue of how do you absorb and integrate migrants, refugees, every country has its own. Canada is particularly good about, if you get a legalization, there's a whole much more effort to really incorporate. The U.S., you get your green card and it's up to you to figure out how you're going to learn English and how you're going. So we don't do a good job of that. But I think the other thing is the most virulently anti-immigrant communities in the U.S. are those with the fewest immigrants. So it always comes down to how do you get to know people as opposed to that other, right? My particular recommendation, my next project is we need national service in the United States, mandatory national service. The worst thing we did was get rid of the draft because our military is now volunteer. And the military does a really good job is of getting people, if you don't have unit cohesion, you're going to lose lives. You have to see the other person as someone who's going to have your back regardless of what color they are, right? And so how do we create that sense of community when we're so different, right? I think we need more civil society in places that perhaps don't have as many immigrants. But how do you do that?
I mean, I agree with that, but I also find, in my travels through the country, for instance, you mentioned Nebraska. In Grand Island, Nebraska, where there's a huge meatpacking plant, I think there are like more than 40 languages spoken in the schools because of the diversity of the population there. So I feel like immigration has touched small town America, rural areas, but I do think, but I think there's a real generational problem. Arizona is full of Mexicans or Latinos, but I meet a lot of retirees in Arizona who don't like the fact that they hear Spanish when they go into McDonald's or Arby's or whatever, and there's this fear of it's the unknown. It's like that the U.S. is not the U.S. that they know, and they are feeling like. Yes, they can't accept that. So I feel, but what brings me hope is that if you go into a school in Phoenix or in Tempe or anywhere in Arizona, the diversity of children, right? They're there, they're learning together. I feel like the younger generations are more accepting than the boomer generation.
I would agree, and then you take Arizona. It's like all the snowbirds. It's the Midwest that's retired. I have a sister who lives in Phoenix, and she says, "Oh my God, these people come down. They drove on country roads. They don't know how to drive in the city. They're like parking on the sidewalk." But I think the other thing is that for many of those snowbirds and now retirees in Arizona, they don't even know the history that in fact Arizona belonged to Mexico and that there are people in Arizona who've been there before the retirees' families ever got to Wisconsin.
Yes, I prefer this microphone. I would like to outline another example, a good practice maybe, and put the example of Argentina. It's incredible how Argentinians are receiving Venezuelans, for example. And it's quite interesting, I think, just to put on the table the way they are receiving people, even traditional, they are this mindset open to receive new cultures. And it's quite, you disagree with the Argentinians? Sí, I'm very big fan for, why?
Porque, ¿cómo tratan a los bolivianos? The racism is pretty, come on, guys. Look how Ukrainians were received across Europe and what's happened with Syria.
But in Argentina, you can access for free to education, for the hospitals, even if you are Bolivian or whatever. So these are good. I think you can improve it. But I would like to highlight Argentina as an example. in Buenos Aires, maybe in the borders, the situation could be a little bit different. And yes, it's true with the Paraguayans as well. But yeah.
I would also like to caution
Yeah.
about small towns. I think you're going to find closed minds all over the place.
Oh,
And when
yeah.
I was working in immigration advocacy, we worked a lot, if you know the story of the forum, which was mentioned this morning when Ali Nourani was introduced, we worked with, it was bipartisan, we worked with conservatives, we worked with people in small towns, we worked with evangelical Christians, and people welcomed immigrants once they got to know them, put a human face on somebody and, on an issue, and it's very different. So I certainly wouldn't just say it's because they're from a certain area, Storm Lake, Iowa, Lewiston, Maine.
Right.
There are many, many, many examples in this country of communities that have received immigrants from very different places. So sorry, go ahead.
I think I have kind of like two questions. On one end, do you think that part of what is happening in the United States is that the way that this nation was founded and the role of slavery in this nation, that they have seen immigrants as the substitution for slavery?
And not for other migrants at all. Or do you have one?
We are playing.
Well, I would say the reason that Cuba, we could have a whole discussion about Cuba and the Cuban American National Foundation.
Welcome, George. George, you want to join us?
And a whole how they built the political power by money and votes. In their case, it was more money to both Republican and Democrats. But I don't want to lose sight to that point about the economic. It is the reduction in unionized labor in the U.S., right? We have the lowest level of unionized at this point. And also the way in which certain politicians use that fear of the other. So instead of being angry at the meatpacking plant for hiring foreign workers, it's much easier to blame the immigrant or the poultry plants in, Arkansas or the South. You've got both poor white and poor, expressing some pretty serious anti-immigrant when they really should be angry at, the poultry manufacturers for, yes, it's cheap labor. And trust me, poultry or meat packing, horrible jobs. So if you're hungry and you would starve in your country, this is still better. Even after 10, 15, 20, 30 years, you can no longer walk and your hands are all twisted because you were cutting the carcasses. Sorry.
We take one more question.
Slovakia, Ukraine. I just have a small comment. So please do not compare Ukrainian refugees with others if you really do not know in details the situation with Ukrainian refugees. It was also in the morning panel. Maybe to some extent to Ukrainians it's a little bit easier, but not much. Situation is the same. As Ukrainian migrant, like words of Daniela of being migrant, is like, I feel it is the same. It's refugees, it's also the same heart. It's also trafficking. It's also forced labor. It's also hate speech. It's also hate criminal acts. Ukrainians are attacked, killed, beaten, just because they are Ukrainians in Europe. Coming here to US, they are not refugees. It's a program, and those are coming here, yes, they have some money, they have a university diploma or 2 diplomas, whatever, but then often they found themselves on the streets, and they cannot apply for those benefits refugees can. This, on one hand, it helps, but actually Ukrainian refugees are used to improve economic situation, labor force with the high-skilled laborers. Like, for example, in Slovakia, they closed several gaps in labor market just with these refugees, letting them possibility to work immediately from the first day of registration. And actually, unfortunately, if you are a refugee, if you are a migrant, it's more or less everywhere. It's the same issues, the same problems. I did not knew so much about the American system before coming here. But when I was listening to you, it was so close to me, to my everyday work with these people, working at the cutting the meat, working in the gardens. It's unfortunately it's so much the same, and we have so much to learn from each other. And so I'm really very grateful for the possibility to listen to you and to compare and to study, because a lot of things we in Europe are following the US and the Americas, and unfortunately all this we will need to fight the same problems, the same issues,
Yeah.
and all these welcoming pictures. It's like a few days on TV, and everybody is met with migrants. Everybody is met with refugees, even if they cover their basic needs. No, working where nobody
We're all
wants to
humans.
work.
Yeah, we're all humans.
Unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your reflection, for your comments. And you had one last question, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Thank you for sharing that, President. As someone who's starting out my career in the migration field, I'm really curious to know what you all think is I know migration is very dynamic, but what right now you think is the area of most need, or maybe what you think is what needs to be done, how you think migration should be managed? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what your ideal.
So we'll do a lightning round on this. What's the one thing that we could work on, that we need to work on?
Yeah, you first.
We need to revive the 2006 bill because it had a future worker, future American worker, so that if a person decided they could come in temporary, so economic, guest worker, but pathways to citizenship. And I really think that that is a key component.
Add to this discussion in a frank way?
I think just in speaking practically, I think there's a dire need for legal aid services for migrants who cross the border. So if you're looking for something practical to do, you don't have to be a lawyer to assist immigrants who need to fill out forms, who need, assistance, writing a claim for asylum, because there's just not enough lawyers. They're completely overwhelmed. And all studies and research show that people who are represented have a better chance of winning their claims, and they're also more likely to follow through and not just disappear into the shadows. So that's what I.
And I would say proximity. Getting to know people is going to change our hearts, which is going to change our minds, which is going to spur us to action that all our panelists have talked about today. Maria, you did say to me when we spoke that how we treat the stranger is a core tenet of any religion, and we're failing. But the fact that we're having this conversation and the fact that all of you are in this room after 2 very full days and you're looking at us very intently gives me an awful lot of hope. So I want to thank our panelists, Maria Echaveste, Daniela Segovia, Miriam, Jordan, and all of you